Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third in the series this month. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And next slide. The Family Violence Law Center has decided to have a political education campaign called Inform Your Vote, where we are talking about different political issues, talking about why your vote is important, and really trying to take a gender-based violence lens to look at voting. And we are joined for this particular presentation with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And they will be joining us for today's discussion on state and local elections. Next slide. And I will let my colleague, Eric, introduce himself.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Morrison-Smith. Pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the executive director for the Alliance of Boys and Men of Color. And just as a little bit of background on the Alliance is a network of 200 organizations really focused on transforming policies and systems that are failing boys and men of color, their families, and communities. And our work can really be summed up into 4 different buckets. The first one being we're focused on winning policy solutions in California and locally as well, really focused and being led by people who are directly impacted and that are focused on addressing root causes and structural barriers. The second piece, we're focused on building power with our network partners. We're also focused on deepening our impact through collective action and learning. And then lastly, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, we're focused on dismantling racist and unjust systems that impact boys and men of color, but other vulnerable populations as well. And over the last 11 years that the network has been around, we've collectively passed over 100 bills in the California legislature and have supported network partners with their campaigns at the local level as well, including securing $121.5 million for youth leadership, economic opportunity, and community building just this year, as well as passing other innovative policy solutions like the Crisis Act, which really is focused on providing police-free responses to local emergencies, including intimate partner violence. And then just the one last thing that I'll mention on our policy work, because it's related to this conversation, is that we do have this core campaign called Healing Together that's really focused on engaging men in the work of ending intimate partner violence, and is really centered around this shared goal that everybody deserves safe and healthy relationships, which then builds healthy and safe communities. And currently the campaign represents more than 95 organizations, all coming together from the gender justice and racial justice movements to work towards that shared vision and goal by advocating the need to shift our approach to end intimate partner violence away from punitive practices and towards community-based healing, accountability, and support. So that's just a bit about the Alliance of Boys and Men of Color and our work, and we'll speak a little bit more around the political education piece that's going on.
So our agenda for today's webinar is that we'll start with an introduction, and then we'll begin talking a little bit about midterm elections and redistricting, and move into a discussion of the number of candidates who are running for election this year, and resources and ways that you can inform your vote during this election cycle. And finally, we'll conclude with a few concluding thoughts. Next slide. I'd like to begin by letting everyone who's attending or listening know that your vote always matters. And in midterm elections, oftentimes you don't have people voting. You have fewer people voting than those that turn out for presidential elections. And power tends to shift because fewer people turn out for those midterm elections. Well, during this campaign, Inform Your Vote, we'd like to talk a little bit more about state and local elections, because as we learned in our first webinar, all politics are local. And so it's very important that you recognize how significant your vote is, particularly during these midterm elections and the midterm elections in 2022. Next slide. What we have here is a comparison between election in 2016, 2018, and 2020, and what the voter turnout looked like. As you can see, in the 2016 election, where the 45th president was elected, 75% of registered voters in California turned out. That was a presidential election year. And of the eligible voters, only 59% turned out. And in the 2018 election, which was a non-presidential election year, only 65% of registered voters in California turned out, and only 50% of those eligible to vote turned out. So half of the people elected our representation in 2018. That should be of concern to us. 50% of the people determined who would be representing us in government. And then when you look at the 2020 election, you had 81% of registered voters in California turning out, and of those eligible to vote, 71% turned out. So you had some record voter turnout in the 2020 election, which tells you that when you care about what's going on, voters turn out. And so it's possible to have really high voter turnout in a non-presidential election year if you care about what's going on. Next slide. Another important thing to remember is to look at redistricting. In the California has when the census happens every 10 years, there is an enumeration of the people in your state. And in the last census count, California actually lost population and we lost a congressional seat. So we actually went from having 53 members of Congress to 52 representatives in Congress. And that also impacts our funding from the federal government. There's $1.5 billion that we lose because of that lost seat. And also that reduces the number of electors that we have in the Electoral College. So that also has an impact on the presidential election once we have another presidential election. And interestingly enough, Texas, which is our competitor, we tend to lose a lot of people moving to Texas. They actually gained 2 representatives and Florida gained 1. Now, those are hotly contested seats in Congress, and they tend to be a little more conservative in Texas and Florida. And so when we start to look at how redistricting impacts us at the state level, it also impacts us at the national level. So in California, when redistricting happened and there was a commission that actually did the work to move people to resize the districts so that they were all about the same size. This is the new map. What you see on the screen is California's new redistricting map. And sometimes in the more densely populated areas, that's why those districts are smaller. And then you can see on the map, some of the less densely populated districts are much larger because there were fewer people. So you have to spread that out a little wider in order to get the same number of people as you would in the urban centers. And so all of this has an impact on elections, on resources and how those resources are shared, and has an impact on your daily life. So we want folks to really consider that and think about these new redistricting maps and how that impacts your vote this year. Next slide. In this election in 2022, we have a number of candidates who are up for election or re-election. You have the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, the state superintendent of public instruction, insurance commissioner. There are a number of candidates who are up for election or re-election in this election cycle. And so it's important for voters to really turn out and pay attention, because these positions are positions that impact your life. California has the 6th largest economy in the world as a state. So the state of California has an economy that's larger than many countries in the world. And so we want to look at who's representing us in the state, who is managing our finances, who is paying attention to our governance. And all of these elected positions are very important to how you experience your daily life. Next slide. And in our local elections, there are also a number of candidates who are up for election or re-election. We have a new district attorney that will be elected in Alameda County. The AC Transit District Director, there are multiple district directors for these transit agencies. BART Director, that is an elected position. You have school board elections in many of the school districts in Alameda County in the Bay Area. You also have the community college district trustee. The Peralta College District is electing new trustees. You have mayors in multiple cities that are also being elected this election cycle. And so we want to pay attention to these local elections because they're closer to your everyday life and what you will experience. And so these are the local candidates that you will see on your ballots, and it's important to understand what they do. So we'll have a discussion now about some of the candidates, and we'll just look into not the candidates, but the role itself and what the governance structure of that role is. Next slide.
Yeah, so I'll take the first person. And for this first role, we're going to focus on the governor and talk a little bit about, what their core duties are, because they do a lot. But, I want to talk about the core duties and the things that we can help shape and should know about. But the first thing, and one of the more important things for California, is each year the governor makes a proposed budget in January. And basically, the proposal shows what the state's projected revenues are going to be for the year and how the administration is proposing to allocate those different resources. And once the governor gets an update of the numbers and the projections in the spring, he or she makes the May revise, which y'all may be familiar with. So it's also just a time for the governor to sort of take another look at the numbers, reflect on whether what he had originally said in January is possible. And if there's more resources, they may add more programming, or if there's less, they may make different cuts. And then one of the things that's important to know, and I'll talk about this when we get to the senators and the assembly members, but the governor plays a key role in the negotiations for what actually gets included in the final budget. And those negotiations typically happen between May and the end of June. So that's one key piece, is the governor really sets the agenda for what the budget priorities are going to be for California and how our taxes are going to be allocated. The second piece that the governor is really focused on is he signs or vetoes bills once they pass through the legislature. So for example, we work on a variety of different bills. And one of the bills that we worked on that I had mentioned in the beginning is the Crisis Act. And, it got through both the Senate and the Assembly, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But once the bill had gotten through, it goes to the governor's desk and he has the opportunity to even sign it into law or veto it, which is actually what happened with the Crisis Act the first time we had tried to advance it. We got it through both houses, got to the governor's desk, and he vetoed it, which is relatively normal. Sometimes you actually have to introduce a bill 2 to 3 times before it gets passed into statute. But, you know, luckily, we were not luckily, because of our work and because we really addressed some of the concerns that the administration had, we were able to get that bill signed in 2021. So that's just, you know, he has the opportunity to veto or sign bills into law. And then the last piece is the governor really has a big platform and has the opportunity to influence and raise key issues in California. So it's really important to know that there are the legislative and the budget pieces, but there's also an opportunity to raise up different issues with the governor that sort of shape and lead the direction that California is going to head. And, you know, he really uses his power and influence to lift up some of the key issues that he believes are important. So that's just a quick overview of, you know, the role of the governor in California. Yeah, and that's it.
Another one of the positions that is one of the contested positions that is under election this year is the state controller. And to be honest, a lot of us may not know what the state controller does. It's like, I don't know what that word means. How do I find out? So there are opportunities to really look at elections, local elections and the state election, and find out what a particular job does. Well, the state controller actually safeguards lost and forgotten property that's been turned over to the state. So one of the things that you can do is go onto the website and find out if you have any unclaimed property, because this person is in control of your unclaimed property. And if you don't claim it, then the state of California makes money from you. So it's a good idea to find out if you have any unclaimed property and that is turned over to you. Another thing that the state controller does is they are the watchdog agency. So they are making sure that governance is happening correctly and that funds are not mismanaged or misused. So when you look at the state controller, what you want is someone with a history of being able to look at numbers and do forensic accounting, basically, looking into governments and state agencies and making sure that those agencies are actually abiding by the rules and the laws, and then being fiscally responsible and financially responsible, using those funds appropriately. So that's what the state controller does. They issue financial reports, they do accounting, and they're looking at the condition of the government, the state government. So those tax checks that some of us are going to receive this month will be signed by the state controller, those tax rebates. And this office is responsible for dispersing payments, millions of dollars of payments from the state treasury. So this is a very important position that we don't necessarily pay attention to. It's an elected position, and this person is paying attention to the finances of our state, which again is the 6th largest economy in the world. So this is a big job, and we want someone in that position who is responsible, who we can count on. And it's a position that impacts our everyday lives. Next slide. And I wanted to do a comparison to a local position. The Board of Supervisors in Alameda County, there are 5 supervisors, and unfortunately, there was a death. Wilma Chan, who was the supervisor for District 3, was involved in a collision. There was a car that hit her, and she passed away in 2001. Well, according to the board charter for Alameda County, the board has to fill the vacancy within 60 days, or that ability to appoint falls to the governor of the state of California. So the Board of Supervisors selected Dave Brown, who was Wilma Chan's chief of staff, and they appointed him to complete her term until the next election could happen. Well, there was a taxpayer group who sued the county of Alameda, saying that Dave Brown was unlawfully appointed. And what the taxpayer group looked at was the administrative code and found that Dave Brown lived in Contra Costa County. And the administrative code says specifically that an elected official in Alameda County must live in the county for 1 year prior to running for election. And Dave Brown had only lived in Alameda County for 4 days before he was appointed, according to the lawsuit. Well, the county council for Alameda County argued that this particular citation in the administrative code did not apply, that the lawsuit was citing code that applied to elected officials, and because Supervisor Brown was appointed, that it did not apply to him. This is still ongoing litigation, and that was the last piece of information that we could find that was published about this particular case. But what it goes to show you is that very active voters can get involved in if they feel that the law is not being followed. And this group of people, as taxpayers, paid attention. They hired an attorney and they said, no, this is not right, Alameda County. So this is how you can get involved. And it's an interesting case study in looking at how you can get involved in elections and pay attention to what's going on in your city, state, county, and the ways that you can sort of find ways to make the law work for you. Next slide.
Yeah, so next I'll talk a little about the legislature and our assembly members and senators. And as you can see on the slides, there are currently 80 assembly members and 40 senators, and they do a couple of different things. One of the core pieces that they're really focused on is policy and authoring bills. So if your organization or if you has an idea on a law that needs to be amended or changed, or a new law that needs to be put into statute, you actually need a legislator to author it and be a champion and sort of lead it through the legislative cycle. And one thing that I think is really important to think about as we think about gender-based violence is that electing people that have a strong commitment to ending gender-based violence means we have more champions in the legislature to author bills around those different types of issues. And another key piece that I feel like isn't recognized or thought about as often is that all these legislators sit on policy committees. So every single bill that is introduced has to go through committees that deal with the issue that it seeks to address. So for example, last year with Futures Without Violence and UCI DV Law Clinic, we co-sponsored AB 2790, centering survivor health and safety, which basically modernizes California healthcare or mandatory reporting laws by connecting survivors to DV advocates rather than mandating a report to law enforcement. And because the bill touches public safety, it actually went through Public Safety Committee, both on the Assembly and Senate side. And having legislators that really understand the complexity of DV and the importance of DV advocates was really essential to passing that bill out of committee. So there's a variety of different committees on finance, banking, labor, whatever the case is, and whatever bill or idea that you have actually has to go through those different committees. And the legislators vote. If they sit on that committee, they basically vote on whether the bill will pass onto the Senate or Assembly floor. The other thing that legislators, both on the Senate and the Assembly side, lead on is budget requests. I had mentioned earlier that the governor really determines, what the budget is going to look like and makes a proposal. but legislators also have an opportunity to make budget requests and work with their, colleagues to get their budget issues prioritized for the year so that when they enter negotiations with the governor, they could try to get those things included in the budget. And, one other example is, last year we worked on a budget ask that was really focused on providing funding and making critical investments for domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. And, unfortunately, it didn't get included in the final budget because we didn't have strong enough champions to really help us, get it included in those negotiations. So legislators on both the Senate and Assembly side also, help with budget requests. And there's other things that they also help with audit requests, for example. We wanted to test and see whether the batterer intervention programs in California are effective. And we were able to partner with an Assembly member to get an audit request submitted so that we can get information and details on the IP system in California. So they lead on both budget, audit issues, and other studies that the state can do as well. And then the last piece that I'll just mention is that I mentioned that the legislators sit on different policy committees, but they also sit on budget committees that really determine what the budget priorities are going to be for each house, for the Assembly and the Senate. So it's really important to ensure that we have good champions sitting on the budget committees as well, because they're the ones that really shape and sort of lead what the agenda is going to be and vote on what's going to be included as budget priorities for each house, which then lead into negotiations with the governor, as I had mentioned earlier. So that's a little bit about the legislators on both the Assembly and the Senate side. And then the last thing that I should just mention is that our state legislators are really your representatives who are voting on your behalf and supposed to be representing your needs. So it's important to understand that. So, and like look into how they're actually voting, because if they're not necessarily representing your needs, there's an opportunity to hold them accountable and push them to do so. Okay, and then, the one thing that I just wanted to add really quickly is that, this conversation is really political education around voting and the different things that are on the ballot. But, there are also a variety of different ways to engage in democratic participation. And I've outlined a couple of, points that I'll just mention really quickly. And I think the first one that's really important is just understanding the different positions and the issues like you're doing right now. So that means looking into trusted sources, joining the webinars, and just, we're going to share a couple of different resources that you could look into to figure out, how people have voted on issues in the past, what their history has sort of looked like, as well as more information on the types of things that these different positions are going to be doing. And then the other thing that I always like to recommend to folks is, it's important to get connected to community-based and grassroots organizations that are in your community that are really aligned with your principles and are working on issues that you care deeply about, whether it be education equity, gender-based violence, worker power, whatever the case is. I guarantee you that across California, there are organizations in your community that are already doing good work and building power to help shape the decisions that are impacting our lives. So I highly recommend connecting with those organizations and taking collective action, because that's really how we build power in our communities. And then the last piece that I'll mention is there's opportunities to participate and engage directly with legislators and the legislature by either sending in letters of support, calling in to hearings to share your support or opposition for a bill, and even joining legislative meetings to share your story or share why a certain issue that's happening in your community is important to you. And I still think that it's best in those scenarios to get connected to an organization that's already doing that work, because they can make the advocacy easy and share resources. But there are those different opportunities to engage with both the legislators and the legislature more broadly. And, those are just a couple of the quick ways that you can engage in shaping, again, the decisions that are impacting your life. And again, we'll share a couple of resources that we think could be helpful as you're thinking about your own political education and getting involved. And here's a couple of those resources, like I mentioned, made sure to include them on the slides and see if we could figure out a way to get these to y'all as well. But you've probably heard of the League of Women Voters. They put together a variety of different resources. And in this case, provide localized voter information that really shows you what's on your ballot, the different polling places, and can connect you to other resources. And I won't go through all of these, but I'll just, highlight a couple of them. There is the Courage California Scorecard and Voter Guide, which is basically a comprehensive scorecard of California legislators, which is compiled from surveys of progressive organizations, which kind of give you an idea of, who's going to be on your ballot and how they have voted in the past. There's also ACLU Action Legislative Scorecard, as well as a Planned Parent Scorecard as well. So there's a variety of different resources out there that, are from trusted sources and that are often nonpartisan as well, that you could look into as you're trying to figure out who you want to vote for and how you're thinking about some of these different issues.
Before we conclude, Eric, I wanted to ask a question about that audit request that you made. Who was involved with advocating for an audit of the batterer intervention programs? I actually just received an email right before we got onto this webinar that the results were out. And so we can read that. I was excited to see that so that I could read about it, but did not know that you all were involved in that. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. So in the very beginning, I had mentioned that we have Healing Together partners that really come from both the gender justice and racial justice movement. So a core set of partners worked with us to both submit that audit request. And I believe, we work with so many different legislators, so sometimes I get mixed up on names, but I believe it was Assemblymember Grayson who actually submitted that letter with us. And basically, the way it works is I had mentioned all these different committees, and there's the JLAC committee, which is the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. And once you submit an audit request, it's best to get a movement of organizations who will send in letters of support for the audit. That committee will basically decide whether it's going to pass or not. So I can't remember all the different partners for this specific audit request, but there was, I believe it was over like 20 organizations who submitted letters of support for this specific audit request. And, it's taken a good bit. I believe the audit request was passed it was either in 2020 or 2021, I can't remember. And the audits typically take about a year just because they have to do in-depth analysis. And as you had just mentioned, we just got the results this morning. So definitely excited to take a look and dig deeper into it. But you can do audits on a whole variety of different issues that you want to have more information to figure out whether state agencies or different systems are working effectively or not.
Well, thank you for that insight into ways to advocate and make those elected officials work for you. Again, this is a very important method of advocacy. And we always want to make sure that survivors know that their voice matters, that they have agency, and that there are ways to get involved and to make sure that government agencies are working for them because they are elected, they are public officials, and they have a duty to support everyone that they represent. So this is great. I'm glad that you mentioned that in the presentation, and now we can look at that and have that as a case study for how to, use different policy levers to impact your experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And looks like we have a question.
Yeah, and that was just my colleague Sybil dropping the audit letter so you can see what organizations have signed on and sort of what the audit request letter looks like and the types of questions that we wanted the auditors to look at.
Oh, wow. So that's amazing. That's definitely helpful. So we'll be able to have those two pieces together the audit letter and what was actually produced in the audit as a case study to look at other ways that we want to really have our government work for us and ensure that they're making the right choices and that the programs that they're funding are efficient and effective. And with that, I'd just like to thank our co-partner in presenting this information for the Inform Your Vote series, state and local elections. We'd like to thank everyone who is in attendance and who might be listening to this later for spending a little bit of time with the Family Violence Law Center and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color while we talk about voting and elections, state and local elections, redistricting, all of this information, which can feel a little heady. And we hope that we broke it down a little and helped it not be so confusing, but also really exciting to really think about how you can get involved and make your voice heard. We hope that you took away some important information, that you look at how your vote matters in state and local elections and how elected officials have an impact on your everyday life. And then also that we've offered you some resources to inform your vote during this midterm election cycle. The election is November 8th, and we hope that you have registered to vote. If not, you can check out our previous webinar about voter registration, accessing a safe at home vote, and registering to vote if you are homeless or if you are part of another special population. If you're formerly incarcerated, you have your right to vote restored. And so we just want to make sure that everyone is informing their vote and thinking about how gender-based violence can be used as a lens to impact your vote, and to talk a little bit about how elected officials are treating gender-based violence in the work that they do. So again, we'd like to thank you. And with that, we are closing this session. If you'd like to get in contact with us, here is our contact information. It will be in the slides, and we'll share those slides out with everyone who is registered for the event. Thank you for attending.